In the quiet suburbs of California, life for Captain John was simple yet filled with meaning. He was a man of discipline, but more than that, he was a man of love. His wife Lara and his little daughter Annie were his entire world. Every morning he woke to Annie's innocent laughter and Lara's warm smile. Their small house carried the scent of fresh coffee, the sound of playful footsteps, and the comfort of a family bound together by love. But in 2005, everything changed. The war in Afghanistan had reached its peak, and the military issued orders that Captain John was to be deployed overseas. The moment he held that letter in his hands, his heart sank like a stone. He stared at the paper, then at Lara and Annie, and felt the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on his chest. At night, he sat silently at the dinner table while Lara tried to reassure him. "You'll come back," she whispered, her hand clutching his. John forced a nod, but deep inside he knew the battlefield showed no mercy. On the day of departure, the California sun shone bright, but for John, it felt like the darkest day of his life. At the airport, he hugged Lara tightly, burying his face in her hair as if trying to memorize her scent forever. Annie tugged on his sleeve, her tiny voice trembling. "Daddy, don't go." John knelt down, holding her small hands in his rough palms. "I'll come back, Annie. I promise," he said. Though his voice cracked with the weight of uncertainty, the airplane roared to life. As John boarded, he turned back one last time. Lara stood with tears streaming down her cheeks, Annie clutching her mother's dress. That image burned into his memory. Inside the aircraft, as the engines thundered and the ground disappeared below him, John pressed his head back against the seat. His eyes closed, but behind them, all he saw was Lara's face and Annie's smile. A lump formed in his throat. He was being carried far away, not just from California, but from the only two people who gave his life meaning. And deep inside, a silent dread began to grow. A dread that the war ahead would not just take soldiers' lives, but perhaps something far darker, something he could not yet name. Afghanistan was nothing like California. The moment Captain John set foot on the barren soil, the air felt heavy, thick with dust and the stench of gunpowder. The sun burned mercilessly above, and the distant mountains loomed like silent witnesses to endless bloodshed. John and his unit were stationed at a temporary camp surrounded by sandbags and barbed wire. Nights were filled with the distant echo of gunfire, the low thrum of helicopters, and the uneasy whispers of soldiers who all shared the same question but never dared to ask: who among us will survive this? John kept a small photograph of Lara and Annie tucked safely inside his jacket pocket. Every chance he got, he would pull it out and stare at their faces. It gave him strength, but it also filled him with unbearable longing. One night, under the dim glow of lanterns, his fellow soldier, Carter, nudged him. "Thinking of home again, Captain?" John gave a faint smile. "Always. It's the only thing keeping me sane. But sanity in war is fragile. Days turned into weeks. The unit faced constant skirmishes, roadside bombs, and sleepless nights. John's leadership held the men together, but even he could feel the cracks forming. He often found himself staring into the desert horizon, wondering if Lara and Annie were safe, if they thought of him as often as he thought of them. Then came the night that changed everything. It was close to midnight when the silence shattered. A deafening explosion rocked the camp, throwing men to the ground. Shouts erupted. "We're under attack!" Gunfire blazed through the darkness as bullets ripped into sandbags. The sky lit up with tracer rounds like fiery comets. John grabbed his rifle, heart pounding. "Positions!" Hold the line. He roared, but the enemy came like shadows, fast and merciless. Soldiers screamed, one after another falling to the ground. Carter, the same man who had spoken of home, collapsed beside John with blood spreading across his uniform. John fired blindly into the chaos, but deep down he knew this was a slaughter. His men were being torn apart. Smoke stung his eyes, screams pierced his ears, and then instinct took over. Amid the chaos, as fire engulfed the camp, John made a decision that would haunt him forever. Using the cover of darkness, he ran. His boots pounded against the desert floor as he fled into the night. Gunfire faded behind him, replaced by the sound of his own labored breathing. He stumbled into a dense stretch of wilderness on the edge of the battlefield, a jungle forgotten by time. There, in the silence of the trees, Captain John realized he was utterly alone. His men were gone. The camp was gone. All that remained was the crushing weight of guilt and the darkness pressing in from every side. And somewhere in that darkness, something was waiting. The jungle was unlike anything John had ever seen. Thick vines twisted around ancient trees, their branches blocking out the moonlight, leaving only fragments of pale silver slipping through the canopy. Every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of his boots on the undergrowth, the distant screech of unseen creatures, the whisper of the wind that almost sounded like voices. John's training as a soldier told him to stay alert, but deep inside, a strange unease crept over him. This wasn't the kind of danger he knew, bullets and bombs. This was different, older, primal. Hours turned into what felt like days. He had no sense of direction. Hunger gnawed at him, thirst dried his throat, and exhaustion weighed down his body. But it wasn't just survival that tormented him, it was the silence. The kind of silence that felt alive. One night, while resting against the trunk of a massive tree, John heard it, a whisper. "John!" He froze. His hand instinctively reached for his rifle, but the jungle around him remained still. The whisper came again, soft but unmistakable. "John!" His pulse quickened. He stood, scanning the shadows. "Who's there?" He barked, his voice trembling despite himself. No answer. Only the sound of leaves rustling, though no wind blew. Then he saw it. Between the trees, faint and flickering like smoke, stood a figure. It looked human, but its edges blurred and shifted, as though it was struggling to hold form. Its eyes glowed faintly, not bright, but enough to pierce through the dark. John's breath caught in his throat. He raised his rifle. "Stay back!" He shouted. The figure tilted its head, almost curiously, and then whispered again, this time clearer. "You left them to die." John staggered back, his heart pounding. What are you?" The figure moved closer, its presence heavy, suffocating. "Coward, you abandoned your men. Their blood stains your hands." Memories of the attack came flooding back. Carter falling, the screams, the fire. Guilt crashed over him like a tidal wave. "No," John whispered, shaking his head. "I didn't. I couldn't." The figure's voice twisted into something darker. "You belong here now. This jungle is your punishment." And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure dissolved into mist. John dropped to his knees, clutching his head. His breaths came in ragged gasps. He wanted to believe it was just exhaustion, just his mind breaking under pressure. But in his heart, he knew something in this jungle was watching him, following him, feeding on his guilt, and it wasn't going to let him go. John pressed on through the suffocating darkness of the jungle, every step heavier than the last. His boots sank into damp soil, and the air reeked of decay. Yet it wasn't the physical struggle that wore him down most. It was the invisible weight of fear pressing against his chest. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, when the jungle was at its most silent and menacing, John heard it, a sound that froze his blood, a child crying. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks again, but the soft sobs echoed clearly through the trees. They were faint, distant, and heartbreakingly human. He felt his throat tighten. No, it can't be, John muttered. He knew there were no children out here. Not in this cursed battlefield. And yet, the cries continued. Drawn by an invisible pull, John moved cautiously toward the sound. His hands trembled as he brushed away vines and leaves, each step taking him deeper into a small clearing. There, before him, stood an ancient tree, its bark gnarled, its branches dry and skeletal, as though life had long abandoned it. But from within the hollow trunk, the sobbing echoed. John's breath came in shallow gasps. He gripped his rifle tighter. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice breaking. The crying stopped. For a moment, the jungle held its breath. Then slowly, the sound began again, louder, closer, coming directly from the hollow. It wasn't just crying now. It was wailing, the anguished sobs of something not entirely human. John's instincts screamed at him to run. Every soldier's sense in his body told him this wasn't real, that it was a trap, something far beyond the laws of nature. But his legs refused to move. He took one step closer, and then he saw it. Inside the hollow of the tree, a small pale hand pressed against the bark. A child's hand, impossibly thin, its nails long and dark. The wailing grew louder, the sound piercing through John's skull. His vision blurred, and terror gripped him. He stumbled back, gasping for air, before finally forcing his legs to move. Without another glance, John turned and ran through the jungle, branches whipping against his face. It wasn't until he collapsed against another tree, miles away, that the cries finally faded. And when dawn began to break, painting the horizon with the first shades of gold, John gathered the courage to return to the clearing. The tree was gone. It was real, and it wanted him. John's mind was in turmoil. He had survived ambushes, gunfire, and the horrors of war, but nothing compared to what he had witnessed in that jungle. A tree that cried like a child, a hand that should not have existed, and the most terrifying part, its complete disappearance with the morning light. He rubbed his eyes, exhausted. His body was screaming for rest, but his instincts warned him that stopping could mean death. He had to keep moving, even if he no longer knew where he was heading. The jungle during daylight looked deceptively calm. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, painting the floor with golden patches. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, and the world appeared alive. Yet John couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, always just beyond the trees, just outside his vision. Hours passed. His water was nearly gone, and his stomach twisted with hunger. Still, the memory of the crying tree wouldn't leave him. It followed him like a shadow, whispering in the back of his mind. By late afternoon, John stumbled upon the remains of a battlefield. Charred vehicles, broken weapons, and torn uniforms littered the ground. The air still carried the faint stench of smoke and blood. His throat tightened. "This is where they died," he muttered to himself, recalling the night of the ambush. He could almost see the faces of his fallen brothers in arms, their last moments frozen in time. As he stepped through the wreckage, something caught his attention. A helmet lay overturned on the ground. Slowly, he picked it up and froze. Inside was blood. Fresh blood. John dropped it instantly, his pulse spiking. The battlefield was old. There should have been nothing fresh left. He looked around, his eyes darting in every direction. That's when he noticed it. The sun was sinking far too quickly. One moment it was late afternoon, the next the sky had darkened into twilight. It was as if hours had vanished in the blink of an eye. No, this isn't right, he whispered. The jungle fell silent again. No birds, no insects. Just that suffocating stillness. And then, faintly, almost carried by the wind, came the sound. Not a child this time, but whispers. Low, indecipherable murmurs. Dozens of voices overlapping, surrounding him. John's breathing quickened. He raised his rifle, pointing it at the trees. "Show yourselves!" He shouted, his voice echoing through the emptiness. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. Shadows seemed to shift at the edges of his vision, figures moving just beyond the light. His skin crawled. And then, silence. Just as suddenly as it began, it ended. The jungle returned to stillness, but the air was thick with menace. John staggered back, pressing his hand against a tree for balance. He didn't know how much longer he could take this. He wasn't just fighting enemies anymore. He was fighting the jungle itself, but deep inside, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. John pressed on, each step heavier than the last. His boots crunched against damp soil as the night began to swallow the jungle once more. The memory of the whispers still clung to him like cobwebs, sticky and impossible to shake off. He needed rest. His body screamed for it. He spotted a cluster of rocks near a clearing and settled there, resting his back against the cold surface. His rifle lay across his lap, ready. But rest would not come easily. As darkness thickened, the temperature dropped sharply. John pulled his jacket tighter, his breath fogging in the cold air. The jungle around him seemed to shrink, the trees leaning closer, as if they were listening. And then he saw it. Between the trunks of two massive trees stood a figure. At first, John thought it was a soldier, maybe one of his men, maybe someone who had survived the ambush. Relief surged through him. He raised a hand to call out, but his voice froze in his throat. The figure wasn't moving. It wasn't breathing. It simply stood there, half shrouded in shadow. "Who's there?" John called, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, a slow, unnatural motion that sent shivers crawling down John's spine. And then it stepped forward, just enough for the moonlight to touch its face. John's blood turned to ice. It wasn't a soldier. It wasn't even human anymore. Its face was pale, waxy, almost like melted flesh. The eyes were hollow pits, black voids that swallowed the light. Its mouth hung open far wider than it should, as though it had been stretched by invisible hands. John gripped his rifle tighter, aiming it straight at the thing. "Stay back," he barked, his voice echoing through the silent jungle. The figure didn't move. Instead, its mouth opened wider and wider, until John could hear it. A sound that clawed at his sanity, the same childlike crying he had heard at the tree. Only now it was louder, sharper, piercing. The sound was coming from this creature. John's heart hammered against his ribs. He fired. The shot rang out, flashing through the darkness. But when the smoke cleared, the figure was gone, vanished. The jungle fell silent again. Too silent. John's hands trembled as he lowered his weapon. He knew he hadn't imagined it. The sound, the face, the way it stood there, it was all real. And it wanted him. "God help me," he whispered. pressing his forehead against the cold barrel of his rifle. But deep inside, John feared that even God had abandoned this place. John didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hollow face, that gaping mouth, the sound of a child's cry bursting from a body that had no right to exist. Sleep was impossible. Fear had dug too deep into his veins. When dawn finally came, the jungle looked deceptively normal again. Shafts of golden light broke through the canopy. The birds had returned, and the air carried the faint scent of dew. For a brief moment, John almost believed it had all been a dream. But the memory of the voice still lingered in his ears, faint as if it were hiding behind the rustle of leaves. His body ached, but he forced himself to move on. Standing still was dangerous. As he walked, he began to notice something strange. The jungle wasn't just quiet, it was watching him. He couldn't prove it, but every time he turned his head, he thought he saw shadows shifting between the trees. Every gust of wind felt like a breath against his neck. By midday, he stumbled upon a shallow stream. Relief flooded him as he knelt down, cupping the cold water in his hands. He drank greedily, letting the liquid soothe his parched throat. But when he looked into the stream, his relief turned to dread. The reflection staring back at him wasn't his own. It was the face, the hollow eyes, the stretched mouth staring up at him from the rippling surface of the water. John gasped and fell back, scrambling away from the stream. His breathing came fast, ragged, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He dared to glance back at the water, and the reflection was gone. Only his own tired, broken face remained. "This jungle is killing me," he whispered. "It's trying to drive me insane." But as much as he wanted to believe it was all in his head, deep inside he knew better. The thing he had seen, the thing he had heard, it was real. And it wasn't finished with him. The hours dragged on. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and every step grew heavier. Yet the jungle offered him no rest, no comfort, just silence. A silence that pressed down on him like a weight, making every sound he made feel too loud, too dangerous. As the sun began to set again, John realized something terrifying. The jungle didn't just hold secrets. It was alive, and it wanted him to stay, forever. By the time night fell again, John's nerves were frayed beyond repair. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was alive, breathing, creeping closer with every heartbeat. He found himself muttering under his breath, the words of old prayers he hadn't spoken since childhood. They didn't bring him comfort, but they gave his mind something to hold on to as the jungle pressed in around him. And then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They crunched over leaves and snapped twigs somewhere behind him. John froze, his breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he prayed it was one of his men, someone who had survived the ambush, someone human. But the steps were wrong. They dragged too long, paused too suddenly, as if whoever, whatever, was following him knew exactly how to keep him on edge. He turned sharply, raising his rifle toward the sound. The beam of his small flashlight cut through the trees. Nothing, just endless trunks and shadows. Yet, the moment he turned back, the footsteps resumed. John's chest tightened. He spun around again. Nothing. "Come out." He barked, his voice cracking. "Show yourself, damn it." Silence. And then, laughter. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to freeze his blood. A high-pitched giggle, the sound of a child. The same sound that had haunted him since that first night. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was right behind him. John whipped around, and his light caught something. A figure crouched low, its limbs bent at impossible angles. It scuttled backward like a spider, vanishing into the trees before he could even aim. His pulse thundered in his ears. He stumbled back, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles went white. The jungle fell silent once more. But John knew the truth now. He wasn't wandering alone anymore. Something was following him, hunting him. And it was patient, too patient. John swallowed hard and forced himself to keep moving. Every step was torture, his nerves stretched thin. He didn't dare stop, didn't dare rest. But no matter how fast he walked, the sound of dragging footsteps always returned. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther. Always there, always following. John's legs burned, but he didn't stop. The dragging footsteps had become a constant reminder that something unnatural stalked him. Every time he thought he'd shaken it off, the sound returned, slow and steady, as if mocking his desperation. By midnight, exhaustion forced him to pause. He found himself in a clearing, the moonlight spilling across the ground like a spotlight. He didn't like being so exposed, but his body refused to go further. He sank to his knees, his chest heaving, sweat stinging his eyes. That was when he heard it again, crying, soft, fragile, the unmistakable sob of a child. John's heart lurched. He knew that sound. It had haunted him since the night of the ambush, since the cursed tree that had whispered through the darkness. But this time, it was closer. Much closer. His instincts screamed at him to run, but something else, something he couldn't explain, pulled him forward. Slowly, rifle in hand, he followed the sound into the clearing's edge. And there it was. A tree stood alone, its bark blackened and twisted, its branches dry as bone. From one of its roots, a small figure sat curled, shaking with sobs. It was a child. Or at least it looked like one. John's throat went dry. "Hey," he whispered, his voice shaking. Are you real?" The child didn't answer. It just kept crying, the sound sharp and desperate, stabbing at John's chest like a knife. Against every instinct, he stepped closer. "Don't be afraid," he said softly, lowering his rifle. "I won't hurt you." The sobbing stopped. The child's head turned, slowly, too slowly, until its face was visible in the moonlight. John staggered back, bile rising in his throat. The face was wrong. The eyes were hollow pits, bottomless and black. Its skin sagged as though it had melted, and its mouth stretched into a smile that had no end. The crying returned, but now it wasn't coming from the child's mouth. It was coming from the tree itself. The branches groaned as the sound grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath John's feet. The child rose to its feet, its limbs jerking like a puppet on invisible strings. John fumbled for his rifle, his hands shaking violently. He aimed, but before he could fire, the tree's shadow stretched unnaturally, wrapping around the child and pulling it back into the trunk. And just like that, silence. Clearing was empty again. The tree remained, standing tall and lifeless, as if nothing had happened. But John knew better. He could still feel the sound in his bones, still hear the faintest echo of that child's sob deep within the wood. This jungle wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it was feeding on him. John no longer knew how many nights had passed. Time had become a blur of shadows, whispers, and faces that weren't real, or maybe they were. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, thirst clawed at his throat, and fear carved itself into every corner of his mind. But then, on one desperate morning, everything changed. The distant thrum of helicopters broke through the suffocating silence of the jungle. At first, John thought it was another hallucination, a cruel trick from the forest that wanted to see him crawl. But the sound grew louder, stronger, vibrating through the air. "Rescue," he whispered, his voice breaking. His heart pounded as he scrambled to higher ground. A massive banyan tree stood nearby, its thick branches stretching out like arms. With every ounce of strength left in his body, John climbed, his palms bleeding as bark tore into his skin. At the top, he waved frantically, his voice hoarse as he shouted, "Here! I'm here!" The helicopters circled, their searchlights slicing through the jungle canopy. For a terrifying moment, John thought they might miss him, pass him by, leave him to the horrors below. But then, one beam caught him, blinding him in white light. Relief crashed over him. Within minutes, ropes dropped and armed soldiers descended like angels. "Captain John!" one of them shouted. "We've got you, sir." John nearly collapsed into their arms as they strapped him into a harness and pulled him upward toward the helicopter. As his body lifted off the cursed jungle floor, he felt something shift below. The trees moved. From above, John looked down and saw shadows stretching across the jungle, unnatural shapes twisting and writhing as if the earth itself tried to hold him back. The crying sound returned, faint but unmistakable, rising with the wind. The soldier holding him shouted over the roar of the blades, "You're safe now, Captain. We've got you." But John wasn't sure. As the helicopter carried him away, he could still hear the jungle calling to him, voices whispering in languages unknown, the child's cry echoing in his skull. And when he closed his eyes, he saw the hollow face again, waiting, watching, promising that this wasn't over. The flight back to base was a haze. John drifted in and out of consciousness, his body trembling with exhaustion. Medics surrounded him, checking his pulse, bandaging his wounds, forcing water into his parched throat. But nothing they did could wash away what he had seen. When the helicopter finally landed, John was rushed into the infirmary. He remembered bright lights, voices calling his name, the sting of antiseptic. Then darkness. Days later, he opened his eyes in a clean white hospital room. The air smelled of disinfectant, not jungle rot. Machines beeped softly at his side. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, John was safe. Or so they told him. Weeks passed. His body healed, though the scars remained. His superiors came, asking questions, but John kept his answers vague. He couldn't tell them about the tree, the whispers, the hollow faces. They wouldn't believe him. Worse, what if they did? What if they sent others into that place? Finally, the day came when he was sent home. The flight back to California was surreal. He stared out the window, watching the world below roll by in silence. Cities, mountains, rivers, none of it felt real after the suffocating grasp of the Afghan jungle. And then, at last he saw them. Lara, Ani, they were waiting at the terminal, tears streaming down their faces as he stepped through the gate. Ani ran first, her tiny arms wrapping around his legs. Lara followed, clinging to him as if she would never let go again. John held them both, burying his face in their hair, inhaling the scent of home. For a brief, fragile moment, everything else faded. The war, the jungle, the cries in the night. He was home. But even as joy filled his heart, shadows lingered at the edges of his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he still saw it. The tree, the face, the child that cried without tears. And deep down, John knew something terrible. He hadn't escaped. He had only brought the darkness back with him. Home should have felt like freedom. The warm California sun, the laughter of children in the neighborhood, the smell of coffee drifting from Lara's kitchen. It was everything John had dreamed of during those endless nights in the jungle. But peace never came. At first, it was small things. He'd wake at night, drenched in sweat, sure he had heard footsteps in the hall. Sometimes when Ani laughed, he thought he heard the sound twist, echoing into that same childlike cry from the jungle. He tried to ignore it. He told himself it was just trauma, memories that would fade with time. But then the dreams began. Every night, he stood again in that cursed jungle. The tree loomed before him, black and hollow, its branches stretching like claws. From within its trunk came whispers, calling his name. And always the face appeared. Pale, stretched, smiling. John. It would whisper, "You left us, but we never left you." He would wake screaming, his heart racing, his body trembling. Lara held him, whispered comfort, but her touch couldn't chase away the shadows. Then one night, as the clock struck 3, John woke to a sound that froze his blood. Crying. Not in a dream. Not in his memory. In his house. He rose from bed, every muscle rigid. The sound drifted down the hallway, soft, broken, exactly as he had heard it beneath that Afghan tree. He gripped the edge of the dresser, forcing himself to move. Step by step, he followed the sound toward Ani's room. The door creaked open. Ani slept peacefully in her bed, her tiny chest rising and falling. But in the corner of the room stood a shadow, tall, still, watching. John's breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled, reaching for the light switch. The shadow smiled. He couldn't see its face, but he felt it. The same hollow eyes, the same endless mouth. The jungle had followed him. "No," John whispered, tears burning his eyes. "Not here. Not her." The crying grew louder, rattling through the walls, filling the house until it felt like the very air was suffocating him. He staggered forward, shielding Ani with his body. "Leave us," he shouted, his voice breaking. "You can have me, but leave them." The room fell silent. When John turned back, the shadow was gone. But he knew the truth, it would return. The war wasn't over. Not in Afghanistan. Not in the jungle. Not even here. Captain John had escaped the battlefield. But the battlefield had followed him home, and it would never let him go.